I, Dr. Sandeep Kumar, Faculty, Department of Education, University of Delhi, welcome you in second session to understand the contextual perspective on cognition. During first session, we explored cognition with the help of four perspectives. These were psychometric perspective, Piagetian perspective, neo-Piagetian perspective, and information processing perspective with reference to basic assumptions, practices, theoretical dispositions to understand the historical trace for emergence of contextual perspective. In this second session, we will talk extensively about contextual perspective on cognition. The contextual perspective begins with the assumption that human mental functioning must consider situatedness of its functioning in cultural, historical, and institutional context. Human mental functioning cannot be understood in absence of its socio-cultural and historical frame of reference. Earlier, perspectives explained human intelligence in varied ways, but its contextual situatedness has been ignored, which limits her explanation or limits their explanation of cognitive functioning and make their explanation incomplete and unsatisfactory. The contextual perspective is different from earlier perspectives in many respects, which we will keep discussing in this talk. The contextual perspective do not accept the forms of mental functioning that are accepted to be existed universally irrespective of socio-economic and cultural contexts. Researches associated with contextual perspective explain how mental functioning reflects and creates the specific setting in which it occurs. In other words, your cognitive functioning is situated in a context where not only it functions or work but also originates. Important to note that there are two basic ideas involved in aforesaid explanation. First, its functioning, and second, creating. Many examples can be taken to explain and to convince people upon it. For example, the contextual differences between America and India will play a major role in creating and functioning of any intellectual practice. Similarly, various regions in India will also provide different and varied cultures for creating and functioning of intellectual abilities. Even within same culture and geographical location or region, school and home provide different contextual framework to engage in the process of intellectual development. Whenever we talk about contextual perspective, socio-cultural context comes into mind. But important is to note that contextual role in intellectuality is also influenced by time, space, and context collectively. It is not that people started talking about role of context recently, but from the time of Wundt, I am referring William Wundt, theorists in some way or other were talking about situatedness of cognition in context. But extensive exploration about the role of context in cognitive development is not very old, and recently people working in the field of anthropology, linguistics, cross-cultural psychology have been at vanguard for revival of interest in this domain. Some of the names are Rogoff, his work in 1990, Cole again 1990, Barry in 1985, very famous. Important to note that there are differences among these theorists, but here our purpose is to see the common shared understanding to build a comprehensive idea of socio-cultural approach. To have a broader understanding of contextual perspective, it is also important to discuss about the socio-cultural approach. It is because contextual perspective directly or indirectly addresses the issues and concerns of socio-cultural aspects of cognitive development. But it does not mean that both of these perspectives are totally different. But to facilitate the development of cognitive schemes, these are presented here in two sessions. Now let's discuss a little bit about socio-cultural perspective before we move to study about contextual perspective. The sociocultural perspective investigates into the contextual behavior of psychological processes. This idea rejects the existence of intelligence or intellectual development and cognitive functioning in vacuum of social, cultural, or historical context. Such approaches strongly believe that context has to be the focal of all kind of theoretical dispositions at their most vital level, because the absence of contextual framework cannot situate the proposed postulates in required stance and will always be subject to misuse and mislead any contextual requirement. Therefore, absence of context make theoretical declaration more theoretical, which cannot be associated with lived experiences as they should be necessarily. Though significant is to note that is to be considered relevant with regard to context and what way it is to be incorporated. Sociocultural theorists are not agreed upon, but what they agreed upon is the relevance of incorporation of context in explaining cognition. What I'm trying to say, there are many things on which sociocultural theorists may not agree upon, but the role of context in explaining cognition they are agreeing upon. Explaining cognitive development will always be half finished if we have left or we leave the idea of creating and reflecting on different forms of mental functioning. It implies that different context imposes different frameworks on mental functioning, which generates the situatedness of cognition. This is also called social cognition. We should not understand this situatedness as total rejection of universal explanation of various principles of human development and cognitive development. However, many sociocultural theorists believe and accept the relevance of these universals, but they argue that universal principles or discourse is so imposing, so dominating, that it has made it very difficult to explore how mental functioning reflects and constitutes in specific socio-cultural context. The universal categories are so over-dominated on our thinking process that in some cases, when theories try to explain cognition in a specific context, they also accept universals. Doing this time and again keep these universals at center and limits the scope of for generating contextual theorizations. This also at larger level hinders the process of addressing the concern in any specific context. Also important to note that most of such universals are from first world nations, that is Western nations, which not only hinders the process of dealing with problems, rather hegemonize thinking process in a particular way. This motivates us to choose any one ready-made solution, instead generating it as per the need of the context. So, socio-cultural perspective starts with historical, cultural and institutional situatedness of cognition, instead accepting the universal as fundamental explanatory core about cognition. This acceptance implies many implications for human psyche. Human psyche gets regulated, articulated, transformed and permuted by social practices and social traditions, because social context provides a fundamental and necessary framework to understand human psyche. It explores and expresses human psyche more as diversity in mind, diversity, identity, self and emotions, instead understanding it in a form of psyche unity for entire human race. Diversity, which has social practices as fundamental constituent, motivates these theorists to explore, elaborate, understand and explain cognition and its development with regard to contextual diversity. People may ask a fundamental question that with his perspective, every context will have different connotations of everything. then it will be difficult to formulate a common course of understanding for conceptualization. In response to this question, it can be said that we need to redefine the very meaning of knowledge, which is defined from the prevailed one, where universality is used as a core for conceptualizations. Whenever we start exploring sociocultural perspective and start explaining any phenomena, Vygotsky's contribution will be highly appreciated. Here also, we will try to revisit his ideas in brief with regard to three fundamental aspects. These three fundamental aspects are: first, analysis of inheritance of cognition, knowledge, and knowing. Second, social context and cognition and origin of higher cognitive functioning. And third, what mediates cognitive functioning. Now let's discuss in brief about all three aspects. First, analysis of inheritance of cognition, knowledge, and knowing. To understand the functioning of cognition, it is essential to know from where and how the related idea originates and what kind of transition they had occurred and undergone. Most of the theorists who valued the importance of social context in cognition had begun first explaining the genetic analysis of mental functioning. Blonsky's views explain this assertion very effectively by saying that history is the source of understanding any behavior. I would repeat Blonsky's idea that history is the source of understanding any behavior. Vygotsky said in 1978 that the importance of historical aspect is very significant in cognitive development. He said, historical study of behavior is not auxiliary aspect of theoretical study, but rather forms of very base in understanding origin of cognitive functioning. Historical analysis of any idea provides us to locate the genesis of that conceptualization, and therefore history play a significant role in understanding any cognitive function. Here, it is significant to know that if we try to reveal the nature of mental process with reference to only fixed or static output can mislead in understanding the actual meaning of mental functioning, and therefore it becomes important to analyze the origin and the changes a human mental function had undergone all through. For example, the very idea of game and mental functions associated with it has its own historical meaning, which provides a diverse understanding to different people. It is because they draw meaning of game from the historical journey all through. So, games carry a historical and contextual perspective. Second point, social context and origin of higher cognitive functioning. A pertinent question can be asked to sociocultural view of Vygotsky that if all mental functioning is associated with context, then how higher order thinking skill will develop and work. There are layers of explanation to address this question. First, we need to understand that according to Vygotsky, mental functioning can be found in general genetic law of cultural development. Note that mental function happens or takes place in a child at two levels. First, interpersonal level or interpsychological level, and second, intrapsychological level. During interpsychological, it appears between people, and at intrapsychological, it appears within a person. In this regard, Vygotsky in 1981 said, I quote, This is equally true with regard to voluntary attention, logical memory, the formation of concepts, and the development of volition. It goes without saying that internalization transforms the process itself and changes its structure and functions. Social relations or relations among people generally underline all higher functions and their relationships. I unquote. It also implies that no knowledge is true, no knowledge is there in mind before we interact with society. Everything has its social origin, and while interacting with the origin in context, we generate meaning and internalize them. Not only this, Vygotsky was so convinced with social role and influence in mental functioning that he believed that even when a person does intra-psychological processes, still she or he remains socially interaction alive. Second, process of co-construction, which explain how a child make meaning of social life. That is, what helps him or her to make sense of the world. It is believed that the dialogic process between novice and more knowledgeable person generates the space for co-construction. The co-construction shares the socially shared knowledge and allows a person to internalize it. An interesting event to illustrate Vygotsky's idea of process of co-construction can be taken from Tharp and Gillmore's work in 1988. How is that work? It is a kind of example given by Tharp. A 6-year-old child has lost a toy and asks her father for help. The father asks where she saw last this toy. The child says, I can't remember. He asks a series of questions. Did you have it in your room, outside, next door, and many more like this. To each question, child's answer was no. When father says, in your car, she says, I think so, and goes to retrieve the toy, and she found the toy. In this case, neither daughter nor father know where the toy is, but they manage to find it with collective dialogic process. Now about third point. Third important aspect is ZPD, Zone of Proximal Development, where it is argued that a child can perform more than actual developmental level to potential developmental level. Actual potential is the ability to perform any task independently, whereas potential development means performing a task with the help of one elder person or more knowledgeable person. Here, we are not explaining what ZPD is all about in detail, but trying to see the critical implication of this idea. Two important aspects of zone of proximal development important to mention according to James. And these are, first, assessment of intelligence, and second, the organization of instruction. It means that intelligence instruction has a clear, close relationship. For both the ideas, it is important to understand that knowing intelligence by a test is not appropriate, and it provides only a limited information about a person's ability. For example, assume we have two 12-year-old children and both of them are able to solve the test made for 14-year-old children. But when provided with relatively higher level or complex question, as significant difference was observed. One child was able to solve the test made for up to 16 year, whereas other was able to do up to 15 year. Can we say both the children have same level of intelligence? Probably no. Because with the idea of ZPD, that is zone of proximal development, and help by an adult increase the potential of child to perform any task. Facilitation by an adult is largely through instructional help, which made child perform the task which she or he cannot do independently. But important to keep in mind that instructional help does not mean that the child will be able to perform exceptionally high. The limit is there up to which she or he can perform. But we need to understand that we cannot conclude cognitive development or mental functioning as what a person can do. Rather, it is the state of coming into being that is more important. So we have to understand the very mental function or cognitive development, a person coming into being. The next point is what mediate cognitive functioning. The third and important aspect which is essential to discuss is what mediate cognitive functioning. According to Vygotsky, tools and sign work as mediation, where tools represent technical tools and sign represent psychological tools. His more focus was on human language, but he also noticed many other aspects which need to be incorporated in the list of tools. For example, psychological tool, which includes language and also various kind of systems, mnemonics, algebraic systems, art, writing, pictures, and so on and so forth. Emphasizing on the role of tool in cognitive functioning does mean that tool necessarily make the mental function effective and efficient. But Vygotsky again in 1981 said, I quote, "This inclusion alters the entire flow and structure of mental functions. It does this by determining the structure of a new instrumental act, just as a technical tool alters the process of a natural adaptation by determining the form of labor operations." I unquote. What is also important to know is that all mediations are the product of cultural history, and they also have to be understood as localized manner. The tool of mediation do exist independent from an individual, and they mediate cognitive functions as part of sociocultural history. Individual appreciates these sociocultural tools to explore the life around them or life around with the help of cognitive functioning. Psychological tool must also be seen in localized manner, where every tool has its specific or special meaning and for a particular context. Amongst every sign is used for a social purpose which influence at social level first and then influence individual. These tools help to communicate first at social level and later at individual level. The social to inner speech gives birth to the process of internalization. Important to note that if any idea become internalized, it does not mean that it stops communicating with social sphere. Rather, now it differentiates the speech towards others and develops a self-regulatory speech function. The idea of internal speech given by Vygotsky was a reaction to Piaget's context or concept of egocentric speech. Piaget perceived it as a problem in cognitive development, whereas Vygotsky accepted it as a process of development where internal speech guides and directs the cognitive functioning. Many researches have been done to verify and explore the role of interaction in cognitive development. Largely, these researches can be classified into two categories. First, child-child interaction, where two childs interaction with each other, and second, adult-child interaction, where interaction taking place between child and adult. There are mixed outcomes of these researches, and these are: children facilitates each other in their cognitive development. Second, adult contributes in learning as they can better facilitate. And third, they can generally facilitate and organize instruction and make learning process effective and comprehensive. And third, adult shapes the context. Adult can shape the context because of their more experience and authority in decision making, which sometimes facilitates and sometimes hinder the process of cognitive development. And finally, children can lead to discovery because they work independently beyond any imposed structure and predefined thinking pattern which provides them space for discovery. So after becoming aware about socio-cultural approach and its associated dispositions, now let us discuss about contextual perspective on cognition. In the discourse of psychology, various terms are used to explain contextualism, such as contextual models, contextual theories, contextual approaches, and many more like this. These all have different meanings from each other. But here, the objective is not to see their differences. Rather, idea is to see how contextuality contribute in cognitive development. Therefore, the term perspective is being used here as it gives broader scope for incorporating all aforesaid categories. There are immense scope to understand the meaning and their implications in contextual perspective. We always have to keep in mind that all theorists will not be agreeing on any one theoretical disposition, which is absolutely fine. There is no harm in this. This disagreement is one of the important characteristics of contextual perspective, because there are different contexts and people working in different contexts, so it is very obvious that they may not be agreeing about the dispositions given by a person or a researcher working in different contexts. The idea of contextuality become more important in the discourse of human development or human development or lifespan psychology and cognitive development, because these aspects engage with socio-historical context directly, which is diverse in its nature and contribute diversely in cognitive functioning. Theorists such as Baltus in 1987, Bronfenbrenner, very famous, in 1979, and Lerner in 1986 have contributed to this discourse extensively by arguing that intellectual development in a person is related to the historical context in which individuals are born and raised. The contextual perspective has a range of ideas as a perspective, but here the basic idea is to understand it from intellectual development and functioning point of view. There is also a range of theorists who contributed to this discourse. We can understand them in three broad categories. First category deals with the pragmatic approach, where practicality towards life is the prime objective. They perceive cognitive function with regard to pragmatic use of the context. William James, John Dewey are the well-known figure of this approach. Second view perceives cognition as useful, adaptive and practical. Therefore, they more work towards exploration of cognitive operations in living practices along with changing functionality and useful activities. James Rawls and Engels 1869 and Harvey Carr in 1873 can be taken as an example of this view. Third view is represented by sociocultural theorists such as Vygotsky, Luria, etc. They theorize that historical, social and cultural context play a significant role in cognitive functionality. Moreover, they say cognition is situated or embedded in socio-historical context. It is important to keep in mind that contextual perspective valued time, space and context significant and effective in process of cognitive functioning, and therefore life is represented as a series of changes and different actions and activities. Different contexts are given value for occurring these actions and activities. Significant to note that only social context is not important. Every action and activity happens at various levels are also important. These levels are biological level, psychological level, ecological level as has been said by Bronfenbrenner, and fourth, socio-historical level. It implies that an action taking place at either of the level influenced by the other levels too. Bronfenbrenner's work in 1979 has explained this relation among various levels effectively, though he was more interested talking about ecological system, which is only one level in contextual perspective. A very important event, that is COVID-19, related to biological level, but it is significantly influencing the social and psychological level of cognitive functioning. Needless to explain about the role of time, space and context in this historic event. not only for a person but for entire human race. In short, it works on twofold circumstantial prominences, that is, interrelated change which carries manifold level, and applied functional psychological action characterizes contextual approach to psychology. I also try to highlight that contextual perspective incorporates multiple levels. These are, again I'm repeating, biological level, psychosocial level or psychological level, ecological level, and socio-historical level, right? Considering the above shared aspect or perspective, we can identify certain common characteristics of contextual perspective. But before that, we need to consider certain cautions important, and that is, first, here attempt is not to establish contextual perspective totally isolated from other cognitive developmental perspective. There may be possibility that we found overlap or overlay of some ideas and issues. And second, there are various approaches within contextual perspective, and it is not essential that all will share common ideas and dispositions. Still, we can draw some common ideas under which, despite differences, some shared ideas can be discussed to understand the contextual perspective. These are, first, formulating research hypotheses or questions or objectives for exploration. Second, formulating research methodology, procedure, and paradigmatic location of method. Third, inferring the outcomes for better explanation and future exploration. Now we are in position to understand certain features and characteristics of contextual perspective regarding cognitive development and cognitive functioning. In further section, we will be discussing about few important aspects of contextual perspective. These are cognitive constructs are multifaceted, multiple ways of change, environmental representativeness, role play by experiences, developmental pliability means flexibility, comparative analysis, communities of practices, everyday cognition and cognitive apprenticeship, and cognition as semiosis. Now let's discuss these points one by one in little detail. Cognitive construct are multifacets. First point is cognitive constructs are multifaceted. Multifacet construct is very important feature of contextual perspective of intellectual functioning. But it does not mean that other theorists were not talking about this multiplicity. Theorists like Gardner in 1983 was also working on multiple intelligence and carrying contextual perspective, but not claimed as contextual theorists. Many other works do exist which use multidimensionality as an essential construct, but are not contextual theorists. This multifaceted feature implies that intelligence has multiple dimensions, which means we cannot talk about a consolidated score of intelligence of an individual. There are multiple intelligences, and all are important for various cognitive functioning. These various aspects can or cannot be independent from each other. For some mental or intellectual functioning, they need to be interrelated, whereas some other they may not be. It is about the context in which cognition has to be an action which constitute the need on aspect for a particular cognitive functioning. Sometimes these aspects can be totally functional and applied, which directly occur with regard to action aspect of intellectual functioning. Therefore, according to Rogers in 1993, I quote, identifying separate but related dimensions of construct allows for the analysis of different trajectories of change across dimensions of a single construct. I unquote. Multiple ways of change. It's the second point. As we know, cognitive structures or construct are multifaceted. So individual responses towards these constructs are also diverse and multidirectional and multidimensional for a particular constitute in a particular time and frame. It also means change in any dimension certainly influenced by human diversity throughout life. Therefore, socio-cultural history of an individual or a social group significantly influence the cognitive function and constructs. These diverse experiences contribute and facilitate the process of engaging and explaining the event one is passing through. Third point, environmental representativeness. The practical aspect of intelligence is directly related to learn for adapting and adjusting or adaptation with the environment every day, which influences the cognitive functioning at every single step. Contextual perspective also accepts this environmental representativeness. It develops a web of various aspects of human environment as done by Bronfenbrenner to illustrate the role of various environmental aspects on intellectual development or cognitive functioning. We are calling it as a web because every environmental aspect is related to each other and play a major role in the development and functioning of human cognition. But the major concern here is how to decide which and what aspect or activity or action or event is environmentally relevant. But to understand it, we can say people have to deal with various engagements every day, and such as student with their schoolwork, employee with their job conditions, doctors with their patients, teacher with learner, and so on and so forth. And they all have to learn to deal with the situations which every time come with different forms and complexities. We all keep learning to deal with them. So, examining environmentally representative procedures and processes shows explicit contribution of experiences in cognitive functioning. The next point is role play by experiences. The role of experience in learning, development, and cognitive functioning is very evident by now. What is more significant to know here is that language we use to explain the concept in contextual perspective. And therefore, it will not be satisfactory if we say that experiences and social context affect or influence our cognitive functioning. I'm repeating this. It will not be very satisfactory to explain the ideas in contextual perspective that social context affects or influences our cognitive functioning. We can accept the term effect or influence initially when we start familiarizing ourselves with contextual perspective. But now at this point, it is not acceptable. Why it is so important to talk about the term used? It is because every word communicates the basis of any proposed idea. Here it is essential to understand that our experiences and social context not simply affect or influence the event or the action which constitutes our cognitive functioning, rather they play a role in constituting cognitive functioning. Why a role? Because role is embedded in the action, event, and context where influence comes from outside. As contextual perspective accepts that intellectual functioning is socially and culturally embedded, makes it very obvious that these aspects will play a role from within context in functioning of cognitive actions. So, the contextual perspective provides ample space for experiences in its process of theorizing the cognitive functioning. It argues that experience provides more space and agency to apply the knowledge, instead only communicating or accumulating information. We need to understand that why elder people can locate more implication of any idea in compared to young children. It is because young child use more intellectual effort in retaining the available information. They take a lot of time and a lot of energy to retain the information, whereas Elder uses more intellectual effort to apply the learned ideas due to experiences which a young child yet to acquire. Neo-Piagetians also take this claim as they also accept the change in cognitive functioning, whereas experiences play a major role. In this entire process, individual differences need to be acknowledged. Developmental pliability or flexibility. Cognitive functioning is not a static phenomena, rather it has quality of pliability, which in general terms as flexibility. To elaborate further, it means there is no age when we cannot learn, rather learning and cognitive functioning always change. Two major points need to be discussed here. First, learning can take place at any age. And second, cognitive functioning towards the same event may not be same at various points of time in life due to experiences. But it also does not mean that one can learn anything at any age. There are human limitations and a person is bound to these limitations. But flexibility in cognitive functioning is another important feature of cognitive aspect or cognitive perspective. Comparative analysis is the next point we should know. The contextual perspective questions the claim of universalism, and to prove its arguments, they have to do at least three kinds of comparative analysis. First, comparative analysis exists between various universal claims to show inconsistency in their claims, because different theorists who claim universal ideas contradict each other. So it becomes important to highlight these contradictions and inconsistencies. Second comparative analysis which is required is comparative analysis between universal claims and contextual claims based on practices and lived experiences. Here objective is to prove the contradiction between universal claim and contextual experiences. And third comparative analysis is comparative analysis among various socio-cultural and historical contexts to prove that every context has its own way of working and practicing life, and therefore provide contextually varied spaces and opportunities for developing cognitive functioning. It also means that contextual perspective accepts the relevance and importance of comparative studies to prove their claims and situated cognitive functioning in specific context. Communities of practice is the next point we must know about it. It helps us to understand the idea that living practices are the best source of knowledge and knowing. As contextual perspective believes in the embeddedness of cognitive functioning in context, it argues that it is essential to participate in lived practices of any community to know about it. Knowing any social practice does not mean to observe it from a distance or understand it externally. Rather, important is to participate in everyday practices of that community. Same way, our intellectual functioning takes shape while participating in lived and authentic practices, and therefore cognition becomes socially embedded. One has to participate in a community of practices if we want to know about the practices of that community. By community of practices, we should not understand that practices only shape the cognition. Rather, cognition also uses its own criticality and analytical ability to interpret the social context, which is constituted with the help of lived practices. The very popular and used term everyday cognition can directly be associated with this feature of intellectual perspective or contextual perspective of cognitive functioning. Another point we must know about contextual perspective is everyday cognition and cognitive apprenticeship. Cognition is not a static product or final outcome of any concept or learning which can be achieved once for all. Rather, it evolves in everyday practices and keep changing with new experiences. Not only this, we also need to understand that cognition itself is a process, and if we do not live this process, we cannot equip with it. Why socialization of cultural practices, gender role, etc. are very effective? Because we live these cultural practices and gender throughout life, and therefore our cognitive functioning is also cultured in this, that we use these developed frames of culture and gender to interpret the other events in life also. So these everyday lived practices generates or develops everyday cognition, and contextual theorists strongly argue in favor of this. Similarly, cognitive apprenticeship also has significant role to play in contextual perspective with regard to cognitive functioning. Cognitive apprenticeship here means learning by doing with active and thoughtful engagement. Such planned engagement provides support and practice to cognitive functioning. When a teacher teaches in a class actively and thoughtfully and provides learners space and opportunity for active engagement in learning, can be taken as example of providing apprenticeship to learners' cognitive functioning. Not only in school, rather in everyday life, we all keep engaging ourselves with many such activities, which eventually contribute in our intellectual functioning. Cognition as symbiosis. The contextual perspective provides important role to symbiosis in cognitive functioning and considers cognition as symbiosis, which means continuously dynamic and productive activity of science. With the help of these signs, we do interactions with the outer world and self and internalize the socially shared knowledge and information. Therefore, we can say that knowledge is internal representation of external reality. Sign and symbols are tools to communicate cultural practices and values and are based off dialogic processes through which one socializes in a context. These symbols are dynamic in nature and keep changing and evolving in a context. Therefore, contextual perspective consider cognition as symbiosis. Now, I'll be summing up my presentation. It is important to note that the characteristics shared above to explain contextual perspectives are neither complete nor special. These have been selected here because they represent the basic disposition of contextual perspective. It does not mean these will not be found elsewhere. It also means different approaches of cognitive development may share same features. Some may misinterpret the whole idea of contextual perspective by understanding it as a unidirectional process, where context only play a role in developing cognition. This is correct, but oversimplify version of contextual perspective and incorporates only one aspect called sociocultural perspective. There are many more aspects which collectively constitute the contextual perspective, and therefore it is not same as sociocultural perspective in its totality. Important to keep in mind that a dynamic relationship between changing skill in a person and expected action and ever-changing context generate the need of compensation in a development of cognitive functioning. So here it has been tried to discuss the cognitive functioning with regard to cognitive construct as multifaceted, multiple ways of change, environmental representativeness, role played by experiences, developmental flexibility, comparative analysis, communities of practices, everyday cognition and cognitive apprenticeship, and cognition as symbiosis. Needless to say, discussion presented here is just a beginning. Lot more is left to know and explore about the cognitive functioning with reference to contextual perspective. Thank you very much for listening this talk. Hope now you will also work toward contextual perspective to understand cognition and cognitive functioning. Thank you very much.